Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Anne Sweeney. I'm the managing attorney for community engagement at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. I am excited to be here today to talk with you about innovation and evaluation as catalysts for people-centered justice, and super excited to have my panelists up here to share their expertise and experience on this topic. Selena Lilly, Dan Lena, and James Toffel, and each of them will introduce themselves a little bit more as we get to each of their portions of today's presentation. It struck me as I attended earlier sessions today that I'm hopeful our conversation really builds on some of the themes that have come up already. Certainly the plenary session this morning and the discussion of human-centered design and building what will work for everyone, keeping in mind people with disabilities as an example of how to do that, I think will really resonate with the idea of people-centered justice. And then I attended the session that the Legal Aid Program of North Carolina led, talking about the culture of innovation, which resonates really well with a lot of the ideas and conversation that we're hoping we have with you this afternoon. So thank you again for being here. We hope we'll connect those two themes with the important step of data and evaluation and how that can move us forward in this space. So I'm going to provide a pretty brief introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to my panelists. So just to give you a little bit of the background in terms of how we're thinking about some of these concepts, and we've had a lot of very robust conversation, I will say, in preparing for today. I think there's a lot of room for discussion on all of these topics, so we look forward to hearing your comments and questions in the app as well. Please feel free to go ahead and add your ideas, your comments, your questions as we're talking. So when we're talking about evaluation, certainly many people will think of that and immediately think, a formal study, hiring a research expert, doing a random assignment design. But we mean really a much broader idea of evaluation. We're really just talking in its simplest sense about the idea of setting a goal and measuring whether we achieve that goal or not. So think outside the box, think broadly about what it means to evaluate our work, our services, our advocacy, our justice system. In terms of innovation, I also want to echo what Ashley Campbell said this morning about the way they're thinking about it at North Carolina. Certainly, technology can be a big part of innovation, but there are so many other ideas and examples of where we can be innovative in the delivery of legal services. And so again, our conversation encompasses some of the technology that helps us innovate, but goes well beyond just technology. And people-centered justice. As I think the term conveys inherently, this is really about how do we keep the clients at the focus, and how do we make sure that when we're thinking about our systems and the delivery of services and the structures that we need to build, that at the end of the day, it's really done in service of our clients and of the people who need to use those systems and those structures and those services. So we think there's two big picture questions that a lot of what we're going to talk about really get to. So the first being, how are we using and how can we use data and evaluation to think about the assumptions inherent in some of our work and get outside the box and really consider creative alternatives to the traditional delivery of legal services and the traditional legal system model. Second, what are ways that data and evaluation help us move the needle, right? How do we use those tools to really change both the delivery system and to inform our advocacy for our clients? As a first question for you all to share in the chat, what brought you in today? What intrigued you about this session? Is there a question or a topic that you're hoping we'll touch on? And we'll attempt to get to those if we can incorporate them in our conversation. And then again, please feel free to keep adding your comments and questions as we move forward. So with that, I would love to invite James up.
Hello, thank you. My name's James Tufel. I'm a visiting scholar of Arizona State University's Justice Futures program. I've been involved with medical legal partnerships for 20 years. I've been involved with legal sandboxes in the United States and Canada, and other emerging work like community justice workers and community navigators in the legal space. So I was asked today to speak about some comments or concepts briefly, and those revolve around people-centered justice and just solutions. Awesome. So when we talk about people-centered justice, and it's an important sort of topic in the world when we're thinking about justice, it's putting people at the center, but what does that mean? We're trying to understand what justice events people experience from the perspective of the people in their everyday lives. We know that the vast majority of justiciable events never reach a lawyer, never reach a court, never reach a formal sort of mechanism of any type. So when we're trying to better understand and build systems and to evaluate issues in the world, we should probably consider some of these concepts of people-centered justice if we want to develop scalable solutions. Other things we want to measure if we're thinking about people-centered justice, oftentimes people go right to outcomes. But we need to understand very basic things which people often don't measure, like what is the leadership commitment? How do you design programs well to get at the people's interests and work that will affect them and things that work in the world? In addition to that, you need to understand what enables programs to scale or sustain in the world, what socioeconomic conditions exist that enable things to mature or fall away as far as program options for people. And we also need to understand empowerment, and that could be various different perspectives. It could be material empowerment, the resources that people receive. It could be psychosocial empowerment, how they feel about their experiences of justice in the world. Or it could be political empowerment, how they've developed a voice in the world. Awesome. So another part of this is not just people-centered justice. So there's a more recent concept that's emerging in the world called just solutions. It's around this idea of what works. And we want to understand at least two parts of this, which is what are the outcomes? What is the outcome that should be focused on? And also what is the evidence base? And that's not just for what comes out on one side, the outcome side. We want to know what works on the process, procedure, scaling side as well. Great. So looking at the world from a people-centered justice perspective and looking at the data around that gives us a different perspective of what justice is in the world. So here's a study from Australia, but I'll give you one in the United States as well. And what that would show you is there are these things called justiciable events in the world. These are events or experiences in people's lives that generally fall under civil justice systems or the related law. So when we look at that concept, there's another part of this. So not all people that have justiciable events, justice things in the world, experience those things as legal needs, meaning that not all people need help to solve those problems. But there is a subset of people who experience justiciable events who look at them as legal needs, meaning I need someone else's help or I need some expertise to help me solve this particular problem. And then the question is, where do they go? And so this study that was just released in Australia pulled these concepts apart really well, getting to legal need itself and asking people, where do you go for help? And most of the time where people go for help is to a non-lawyer. And then the next question is, given that you're going to this source of help, is your issue met? Has your goal been achieved given that you're seeking a form of help? So more people are going to non-lawyers than lawyers for their help. And we look at if the issue is met or if it's resolved, what we find is the resolution proportion is as high, if not higher, by non-lawyers than lawyers. So this is an interesting thing, but people could say, who cares about Australia? We're in the United States, we're special. One thing that is interesting is what we find is in this justice research is the United Kingdom and Australia tend to be about 10 to 15 years ahead of us, and we find out all this stuff a bit later. But thankfully in the United States, we recently had another study, something I call the 10,000 Voices study. It was conducted by Isles and Hill. And what that study found was very similar findings, that people are more likely to go to non-lawyers for help than lawyers, but they did something else that was interesting. And they said, when you're going to your source of help, tell us about that experience you have with that source of help. And where lawyers did better than some other people was on process and procedural clarity. Now, lawyers weren't even the best on process and procedural clarity. The best at that was financial institutions. So for some people, if you're thinking about being a good sort of business in the world and people liking you, a bank doing better than you should raise some questions. So I called my bank a few times. But what's interesting is if you look at the type of provider that people like the most when they're engaging in their justiciable events to try to understand how to resolve the problems they're experiencing in their everyday lives, the people they like the most are mental health professionals or medical professionals. And you ask people, well, why do you like these people so much? And they say things like, I can express my feelings and views. And if you're concerned about issue spotting, that should be a problem if people don't feel like they can do that well to lawyers and they can do it better to their mental health provider. In addition to that, they believe the things they're voicing to that mental health provider are going to result in outcomes, more so than how their voice plays out in the outcomes when they're speaking with a lawyer. They perceive mental health providers as a more objective resource when speaking to someone trying to get help. They also think about the idea of correctability. When they go to the mental health provider, they believe that could, if something goes wrong, it could be fixed. And that's important if you're scaling something to people, if you're trying to get something to people, because people want some trialability aspect. If this goes wrong, I can still get some other help after this. But the other important things that has emerged in other research is that non-lawyers tend to really excel at things like treating people with respect, building trust with people. Other research has found these things as responsiveness, being timely in response, communicating well with people, showing empathy that you actually care about their issues, which is expressed in that expressing feelings and views concept there. Cool. So those are the very broad concepts around people-centered justice, some of the data in the world that we might want to consider if we're developing solutions for people that will likely be effective, impact outcomes. We might want to also consider maybe building things a bit backwards than sometimes how we build things now. One example of how you can measure things very simply is in the state of Delaware, there was a Senate bill passed to support right to representation, and there was also a Supreme Court rule change around allowing non-lawyers to represent people in landlord-tenant cases. So right to representation is a little bit different than right to counsel. In a right to representation, you could have a non-lawyer or lawyer represent you. Right to counsel tends to be a bit more focused on lawyers alone. So we want to understand the experience of people who are engaging in those services. And so one of the things that's an innovation in a lot of legal services is to simply ask people, why are you here? What is your goal? This is an amazing thing that this is an innovation, right? What we're often doing is saying, what's your issue? And you tick box them into the boxes you have available to you. So we're not really doing a good job of assessing what the consumers are who are coming in for legal services want. And so it's also hard to figure out if they're attaining what they want. But Neil Steinkamp, who has been here and maybe is still here, he's the guy also known as the Stout Report. But Neil Steinkamp produces really amazing reports, and he's popularized this idea, and it's also going to be implemented in Delaware with qualified tenant advocates around why is it important to do something like goal attainment scaling? Why is it important to ask people about their goals and if they're attained or not? And the reason for that is the vast majority of people have a goal to be met that is not the traditional pull-down codes of like preventing eviction, right? So if we're not assessing the goals of people and we're not seeing if we're attaining them or not, that's going to underestimate the impact we're having on people's lives and also the value we're producing when working with those people. Another very simple thing is oftentimes we only focus on consumer experience. So a lot of my background is in health. And one of the great mistakes that was made in medicine and healthcare is only focus on the patient experience, or in this case, in the legal world, the client experience. We also have to do very simple things like look at the provider experience. So there's a new innovation in the world called legal first aid. It trains community navigators to address basic issues among people in a community setting. And one question is, how much, or do you in any way like this training? Would you recommend this to a friend? And what's incredible is when you look at that, that's a good thing if it's positive. It's not good if it's not positive. But in this particular program, Legal First Aid, when you ask people about the quality of the training, it gets something called a Net Promoter Score. Basically, would you promote this to a friend or colleague or not? And the answer is world-class scores, right? So they tailored their training to the people and the providers that they were going to work with. These are health, social service, human service providers. And those people find it very helpful to be upskilled in very basic elements of the law. It helps them do their jobs better. It helps them meet the needs of the people they're serving better. So those are very simple sort of metrics we could look at, is what is the consumer experience and what is the provider experience. Since I only have a very short period of time, a lot of times, because people ask me as a magical person that may or may not know something a little bit about data, what is the data answer I need to solve all the problems? And that's really, really bad. I know things are going to go badly when that's the question. Where people struggle, even when they have data and that data has been analyzed, is how do you use that data to communicate value? So when I originally got involved in medical legal partnerships 20 years ago, the question wasn't really about, do we have the data? And it wasn't about, can we analyze the data? It's how do we communicate that data to have value for the people we're speaking with, the stakeholders. In that case, it was creating a return on investment argument, because when you're talking to hospital CFOs, they like money, and if they're giving money out, they want more money coming back, right? So that was a very salient argument for them. Another important part and struggle that people have is we have all this stuff. We think we have an ability to communicate our value, but they have a really hard time communicating that value to people that are external from their core social network, right? So you'll see this a lot with people engaged in innovative services. They have their core group and they have their own little chatter that they do, and they try to step outside of that and they fail, right? So one idea is communicating value generally is a struggle. Another one is, how do you communicate value to stakeholders that may not be like your core circle, which leads to the one everybody obsesses over, right? Funding. So when you look at data and how it can sustain your programs, if you don't solve for those first two things, you're probably not solving for the funding struggle or problem. And the last thing, I'll say two other things shortly, because everybody's bogged down with so much work, so much operational task work. No one gets to strategic planning, right? So it's hard to get to figure out how to communicate your value in an innovative way, or to connect with new partners when you're just doing the day-to-day. And so getting outside of that framework is really important for people to use data effectively, to think about how they can use it strategically and in their planning. And the last part is, and this is a struggle I think a lot, sometimes when people want someone to help them with their data, they go to academics, and then the academics give them an answer they don't necessarily like sometimes. And the reason for that is academics typically hyperfixate on things like accuracy. What's the perfect study to give us the most accurate result? That may or may not be helpful. So academics overemphasize accuracy, like a randomized controlled trial, and they sometimes underestimate the value of utility, right? These types of things. How are you communicating value? What do people want to know and hear? And if that doesn't happen, oftentimes the data won't matter, right? So we need to have a utilization focus on our data, not simply what are we collecting and what is the magical metric, because it depends on your context and your stakeholders. Awesome. So that was brief. That's my time.
All right.
Dan Leenistow to give the next presentation.
Is this on? Okay. We're going to attempt to integrate a few questions in between our speakers, and I'm just going to call it a couple to keep us moving forward. So one of the questions that we received, how do you ensure that innovation and evaluation are both people-centered and community-led? Do any of the panelists want to provide some reactions to that?
So if it is people-centered, it is by sort of definition, I think, community-led. It's going to be hard to do something that isn't community-led. I think this is one of the struggles is, from what I've heard at this conference, there's a lot of discussion around how will these issues affect lawyers? How will AI affect lawyers? How will these other intermediaries affect the world? but that's not putting people at the center. It's not putting communities at the center. So you should have people that are reasonably representative of the communities that you're serving, and those will be the people that you're centering around, if that helps your answer. Here we go. Just right.
So at the organization where I work, it's kind of built into the model of how we do practice, do our legal practice. And so we partner with community-based organizations, and they help us decide. They help us decide like what cases we're taking on, and we take on the cases from their membership. And so thinking about like what's the structure of your organization and how you're getting the cases also can make a big difference.
One of the other questions relates to the, I guess I'm going to combine a couple questions. So both, how do we consider client experience and client satisfaction in addition to impact and outcomes in our evaluation work? And then related to that, how do we do that in a way that is not actually just burdening our clients more by asking even more of them after they've already had to experience the issue that brought them in our doors?
So if I'm comprehending correctly. So I think if you reasonably ask someone in an empathetic way and not a confiscatory way, why are you here today? What would you like from me? I don't think that will be a problem. I think one of the things that's interesting is, at least in Delaware as an experience in emerging qualified tenant advocates, they seem to be much better at all these empathy tasks than lawyers are. At least that's what people are saying. And so I think there are just general skills that need to be built in how to interact with people. So it's a positive interaction. And as far as balancing outcomes and consumer experience, I think one of the interesting things about a person or people-centered approach is that if you do this right, you're getting a 2-for-1, right? The consumer experience and the outcome are in part one, right? If I ask you, what are your goals? What would you like from me or this experience? And at the end, I ask you, has that been attained reasonably well? We're getting both of those things to some degree in one measure, which is a greater efficiency and also more linked to the person themselves. So you can get 2-for-1s if you do person-centered approaches properly.
Dan, do you want to take us to the next section?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Dan Lina. I'm a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago, where I have a joint appointment in the law school and the engineering school. Before joining academia nearly a decade ago, I was a practicing lawyer. I was an equity partner at a large law firm. And before that, I worked in tech as a developer, as a consultant, as an IT manager. And so what I'd like to do is develop a little bit more about these ideas around evaluation. And I'll talk about randomized controlled trials, which James said sometimes, academics can hold us to too high of a standard and get worried about design like that. But then hopefully talk a little bit about some of the other things we need to think about as we talk about evaluation, the effectiveness of legal services delivery, and the impact that technology can have across this whole space. So the first thing, right, one of the things that's been motivating me in my work here for over 10 years in this space is just the idea that the majority of the population now is walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket. Okay? And so what can we do with that amazing computational power to deliver legal information, legal services, give people the things that they need to have access to justice? And when I talk about that frequently, one of the objections that I get is that, well, what you're talking about, Lina, is second-class justice. Like, what do people mean when they say that would be second-class justice, right? How do I break that down and understand what are the things here that we can actually measure and assess? So what can we evaluate so we understand better, so we can address those objections, but then also better understand what are the things that technology can do where humans need to be playing a greater role, right? So where can we automate things? Where does technology augment people? And where is it just, these are people tasks. People need to be doing these things. So when people say some of these things, sometimes I think one of the things they're talking about, well, these systems are not reliable. They're not going to be safe. People are going to get ineffective or incorrect guidance. There's bias and discrimination in these systems. How do we measure that? How do we evaluate for that? These systems are not robust. They can't do all the things I can do as a lawyer. They're not trustworthy. Lack of empathy and trust, right? James mentioned this, empathy being a measure. Can we build those into systems? So I'm going to show you a study where we looked at that. Individuals won't understand or act on the guidance they receive, right? Do we have studies that actually evaluate outcomes that we know not only to give them the right information, but they acted on that, and what was the outcome from giving them the right information? And then this aspect of, it could be dehumanizing. Everyone could deserve a human lawyer, right? And how do we understand where that might be the case and actually what preferences are around these things as well? So some of this builds on work I did about 4 years ago, talking about there was more of a movement then to how do we evaluate technology tools, but at the same time I said, yeah, but we don't even know how to evaluate human lawyering, right? I mean, different humans are doing things very different ways, from the fanciest law firms down to jailhouse lawyers, and we don't really know kind of what's effective, what's not. And one of the ways to describe this is look at medicine compared to law. And 120 years ago, law and medicine were kind of in the same place, where there's you had a community of practice and people would talk about the way they do things, right? You might be a doctor 120 years ago and you say, oh yeah, well, I had people come to me, they're kind of blue, and I gave them cocaine and now they're feeling a lot better and it's going much better. And then we started to gather some data about longer term outcomes and say like, gee, well, but maybe that's not so good because that produces some bad outcomes. So in medicine, there was this empirical turn and we have a lot more data-driven, evidence-based practice. But in law, we still really don't have that, right? So that creates a lot of problems. And you can think about evidence-based practice in small ways, about just even using lean thinking or design thinking and user testing and gathering information and continuing to try to improve, or all the way to the best of empirical methods and randomized controlled trials. So one of the things that we've done at Northwestern is we've been working with a project called Rentervention, and some of you know Connor Malloy, and you've seen this here at this conference. It's a bot in Chicago that provides information to tenants in landlord-tenant situations to get security deposit backs and all sorts of other challenges that it can help solve. And more, I mean, this is mostly rules-driven, but more and more large language models are playing a role in how this works. And one of my colleagues and I, we wanted to evaluate this. We wanted to put in place a study so that we could evaluate how well this bot worked at solving people's problems. And so what we want to do is run a randomized controlled trial. You'll see this. This is like in phase 3, or a longer term goal. We want to get to the point where we can take this chat bot and have human lawyers, and people come to a legal aid organization, and we randomly assign people to use the chat bot or to get a human lawyer, right, and measure the outcomes. Now that's the gold standard, randomized controlled trial doing that. The first step, though, what we did a simulation where we evaluated this. So we set up the chatbot. We had 2 different versions of the chatbot. We had one with very plain language that would give people advice on how to, what they needed to do to get a security deposit back. And then we had another one where we used the best of social science to revise the language so it's using empathetic language. So we wanted to see what's the difference between these 2 different chatbots, designing them that way. And then we had a frequently asked question list. So like if you land on a website and it gives you all the information you need to get your security deposit back. So we had 277 participants for this randomized controlled trial. We wanted to understand, well, can the AI system help them identify and solve the problem? And does it exhibit empathy and develop trust with the end user? Well, those are some of the things we're using. So this is a scenario. This is in your materials, but a pretty, more or less straightforward scenario. So you think about, we're thinking about the design of this system. And we did introduce anger for half of the participants, right? So that was kind of like something else we were trying to test for, is like, does empathy help if you if you have an elevated state of mind kind of going through this and seeing how empathy played a role in that. These are the kind of questions we asked, or we had a few different questions. Self-reporting, how helpful is this system? Whichever one they got, the 2 different versions of the bot or the frequently asked questions list. How trustworthy is the system? And different questions to try to measure that. And then the cognitive effort, right? We wanted to figure out, like, well, how difficult is it for you to solve this problem using the FAQ versus the 2 versions of the bot? And now this is very small on the screen, and I know it's going to be difficult for you to read. But what we found, right? So we found the bot proved to be far more helpful than the frequently asked questions site. When we asked people, that's what they said. Both when we introduced anger and we did not. Trustworthiness, it was interesting that when they didn't use the bot, When they used the bot, it was rated as more trustworthy, except for when we introduced anger. When we introduced anger, it turns out people didn't like the bot. Now, we're not really 100% sure why. Like, maybe it was just like, well, this stupid bot, this is a dumb system, but we're not sure exactly what's going on, but some sort of interaction there. So we had cognitive effort, far less with the bot versus the FAQ. And then you can see in the bottom, we compare empathy versus non-empathy. When it had an empathetic system, people were more likely to say it was helpful. And we had a similar sort of interaction where when anger wasn't introduced, they thought it was more trustworthy and less cognitive effort. Right, so again, this is just phase one. We're working on building now open source systems. We want to build a platform where to make it easier to build these different AI systems. And to this point of like what James said about a lot of these discussions now being focused on lawyers. For over 10 years, I've been trying to get people like to focus on, hey, they introducing these systems. These systems are very capable. Not AGI, there's a little too much hype, but these systems are capable, and through engineering, we're going to be able to augment and automate a lot of tasks that lawyers do these days. We have to think about how delivering legal services is really going to change. But now we've got this shorthand saying, which drives me crazy, about like, AI is not going to replace lawyers. Lawyers who use AI is going to replace lawyers who don't use AI. And it's like, that's ridiculous. Like, is anyone thinking about like whether like there's so much deeper analysis that's required here? Because one of the other things, we can develop really capable self-help systems where you don't need to be a lawyer and you can solve complicated legal problems. And we need to do more research like this that is not just focused on the cognitive capabilities of AI systems, but getting into the social intelligence of these tools as well and measuring things like empathy. Okay, so I think there's a lot of opportunities. We need to do a better job in academia of doing research that's accessible to help inform in this space. And then to the point of some of the other presentations today too, just thinking about things like design thinking, measuring some of these things that are important in evaluation as you're rolling out different tools, defining carefully what's important as you're rolling out programs in this whole evaluation space. Okay, so I look forward to hopefully us being able to have some additional conversation about what can be contributed to this space through randomized controlled trials and other more rigorous methods of evaluation. Thank you.
Right. So just a reminder, feel free to keep throwing your comments and questions in. I want to circle back. I think one of the examples you shared, you don't know why did the anger change the equation, right? What are the results there? And I feel like that's a great example of where engaging the people who are most impacted by our programs, our systems, our evaluations, our pilots is essential, because that's where we might start to understand some of the whys, what's going on. The people who have the lived experience can really inform that conversation. And we might not have a definitive answer, but it's going to help us begin to sort of unpeel the onion and get at a little bit more of what's going on that can't be easily measured on the surface. I also wanted to share, with respect to some of the questions in the chat about the concern about burden on clients. I think I would offer a similar answer, which is, if we have invited the people we are trying to serve to be part of our design from the beginning, and if they are planning with us and engaged as genuine partners in figuring out what the right question to ask is and how to examine that question and what data will help us answer that question, hopefully we do that in a way that they feel very much a part of the process, not burdened by that evaluation, whatever that process looks like. But I would say, the important additional piece to that is then a commitment by the program, by the policy, by whoever is in charge, to make genuine changes based on what you learned. Because if we've asked people to participate and then we find out that what we're doing is wrong and we just keep doing it, that is sure to eliminate whatever trust we have possibly already established. So please.
Well, on this point about getting feedback, I think it's an important one. And even in big law firms, there's a lot of reticence about sending out these feedback forms and things like that. But there are ways to do it, and people are surprisingly want to share, want to give that feedback. But then also think about like when you've been at the airport and you come out of the restroom and there's like like just one of those kiosks where you can hit like thumbs up or thumbs down kind of thing. I mean, there's so many different ways to get some sort of feedback from the people we're serving to give a sense if we're headed in the right direction.
So I'm going to share one of the questions that seems to be of interest to several folks, and if the panelists have ideas now, that's great. And otherwise, let's just try to circle back on this before we wrap up. We'll have a little more Q&A after we hear from Selena. But the question is about evaluating our work related to racial equity, and where organizations, and many of our organizations have done this in the recent past, developed plans to address racial equity. How do we hold ourselves accountable to those plans? And are there examples of where organizations are doing that? So I think that's an important question, and gets at this point that what we're talking about today is both tools and ways to innovate in terms of our organizations and our service delivery, as well as our advocacy for our clients. So both the internal and the external facing side. And I hope that's a good setup actually to invite Selena to the mic.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Selena Lilly. I work at Take Root Justice as their Director of Data and Resource Management. So yeah, I really appreciate James and Dan sharing their perspective. But my perspective is going to be a little bit different, coming from, a smaller, resource-strapped organization, and how we're thinking about some of these topics. So first, a little bit about Take Root Justice. So we use a community learning model. So essentially that means we're working with community organizers and grassroots advocates to bring about, broader social change. And so we typically take on like affirmative matters and housing, workers' rights, land use cases. But we do take on some defensive matters as well. But all of our cases come through community partners that are based in New York City. And so when we were hearing from our community partners, one of the things that we've heard is that they were interested in figuring out ways to use data as part of their advocacy. And so we do have kind of a participatory action research arm of our organization. But sometimes folks are like, we don't have the capacity to take on an entire research project. There's already a lot of data that we were collecting via the intakes. But really that data was just kind of being shipped off to funders, and we weren't using it to support our partners. And so we wanted to change that. And so it started off with, thinking about like having some conversations with our partners, thinking about what is our philosophy around data. So we have like a really strong focus on kind of the legal side and thinking about how do we do legal practice in a way that feels like equitable and shifts the power dynamic so that folks feel empowered when they are receiving legal services, and how can we do the same thing with data? And so we had conversations, we assessed our data philosophy, had more conversations with partners, and developed some data initiatives, which I'll get into in a moment. Had sense-making sessions, and continued to like evaluate the process as we continue to go through it. And so in thinking about what our kind of data philosophy is, we learned about these like data feminism principles, which is essentially a way of thinking about data that shifts power, challenges power, elevates other types of data, not just focusing on like quant, but what are the like stories or other ways that people receive information that's really important. Rethinking, binaries and hierarchies, and how we're thinking about the data that's out there. So we're not kind of putting people into really small boxes that may continue to perpetuate oppression. And so yeah, and having kind of those conversations, we've kind of adopted these principles ourselves. The book is available online, so if you download the slides and click the link, all the chapters are available there if you're interested. And another thing we did was like investigate our data visuals. So thinking about what is the like context, and how can we incorporate that into how we're presenting the information to partners, making sure that we're having conversations about visuals, again, having those sense-making sessions so that there is a back and forth, and we can incorporate what we're hearing from partners into the visuals as well. And then, as mentioned in the keynote earlier, thinking about when it's appropriate to use kind of an average display like in this bar chart here, and when it might be appropriate to show more of the data like in this B-swarm chart, which has all the kind of single observations as well as showing kind of the averages so people can see kind of the individual stories and the spread, which is really critical to how community organizers work and advocate. And so making those kind of shifts. So one of the projects we worked on was for Department of Labor Advocacy. And so the partners indicated that it would be helpful for them to understand the extent of wage theft cases. And so we had conversations, we started to utilize some of the data that we were already collecting, and they were able to advocate with the Department of Labor for them to investigate smaller amounts, so in the $500 to $1,000 range, and for the DOL to have longer look-back periods. Another project we are working on is facilitating these peer learning communities where CBOs can come together, share best practices, lessons learned, challenges, and also just work on or workshop together metrics that are going to be important for their advocacy. And so for us, I think it's really critical that we're not kind of barging in and saying, this is what you should measure, but we're having a conversation and hearing from the community, what are the important elements that they want to track, and what are their campaigns and their goals, and how can we collect data around those items to support their work. And then the last one I'll talk briefly about is a database we created for tenant advocacy. And so we took Airtable, which is kind of like a spreadsheet database hybrid, and connected it with the New York City open data sets related to housing violations, eviction cases, things like that. And they're able to use that as a door knocking tool to support, tenant leadership and advocacy in buildings. And, they can update whether, this person is a TA member or how many violations are in the building, and update contact information, different things like that. So it's providing additional capacity to these organizations to do that work. And yeah, I think for all of these projects, a key component for us was just like having those conversations with the partners, because if we come in thinking like, we know what you need, we might just, miss a big opportunity to work together to develop something that, as I mentioned, is both useful and yeah, that they'll utilize.
So I would suggest that Selena just answered, in part at least, the question about how do we make sure to think about our measurement and our work in a way that is accounting for community's perspective and is intentionally inclusive. And so that would potentially be part of the answer to how do we measure our racial justice or racial equity plans inside of our organizations, right? There is, I would imagine, not one data point. There's not one type of assessment that we're going to do to figure that out, and understanding the complexities of the history and the dynamics that we are working to unravel and to eliminate is a very long-term process. So trying to build your measurements to account for that and to recognize you're not going to get the whole story in one survey of your staff, at the end of the year. Just to be extreme in my example, is an important part of the planning. Anybody else want to add any comments to those questions or any of the others?
Just briefly, I mean, as far as equity, one of the great challenges, I'll just go with it. One of the great challenges with equity is who are the providers, right? And I can say at least opening up the door to other avenues to become a legal provider is very important if we want to push for something resembling more equitable workforce. There's also not just building workforce, but there's building activities or upskilling people within their workflows if they're in other types of organizations or areas. So there are various ways that we can get to more equitable delivery systems if we reimagine how we're delivering services.
All right, so I just want to briefly share an example of work that we're doing in Ohio related to some systemic advocacy. And this is a project focused on debt-related driver's license suspensions. And so this timeline really just reflects kind of how long this has been in the works in terms of our recognition of it being a problem for our clients, but then how we've used data to sort of get to where we are now, which is at a stage where there's there's legislation introduced in the Ohio Senate that could be really transformative. So it started just by recognizing the problem in our bankruptcy practice, doing some intentional piloting of other work, ultimately handling some affirmative litigation that prompted us to really want to understand more about what was happening and how big the problem was. And so we did a public records request to the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles for 5 years worth of data, and quickly realized that we had a huge problem on our hands. So the scope is, just in terms of the numbers of drivers over a 5-year period, about 8.5 million people. The total amount of debt over that period of time is over 750 million. This is really quite significant impact, and the impact is not felt proportionally across Ohioans. So I know this is small, but the darker blue areas of this map show where there are the highest concentration of debt-related driver's license suspensions. And while many of those are urban areas, it is not exclusive to urban centers in Ohio. And we also wanted to know how this problem related to people who have low incomes. And so this graph shows us, we took all of the zip codes in Ohio and grouped them into 10 groups, with the wealthiest zip codes being the far left on the x-axis and the poorest zip codes on the far right. The y-axis is the number of debt-related suspensions. So it is, I think, quite obvious that those folks living in the poorest zip codes also have by far the highest number of debt-related suspensions. We were similarly curious about whether this problem relates to race and did a similar analysis. And the results are even more striking in the same framework. So the far left bar are the zip codes in Ohio with the smallest percent people of color based on census data. The far right bar are the zip codes with the highest percent people of color, and the number of debt-related suspensions are on the y-axis. And as you can see, this clearly is a problem that impacts people of color and people who have low income at a significantly higher rate than people who are white or who have access to financial resources. So I share that example because we were able to use that data in a report that generated a lot of conversation, and I think was part of a larger community effort that ultimately resulted in the legislation being introduced. I will say, though, and especially in the context of this conversation, one of my lessons learned in working on this is we needed people impacted by this problem involved even earlier. And we have engaged with neighborhood groups, and we have worked with former clients to help inform the advocacy. But I now appreciate that we really could have had people be part of the thinking and the planning and the understanding at a much earlier stage. And so, to see how that might have even informed the work to bring us to, a solution faster or more creative solutions or additional options, I think is one of my takeaways. And we're still working on this, and we'll still continue to make that effort. But I think it's become super apparent to me that just how vital having those voices be part of the conversation can be in achieving outcomes for clients. So I can't see the chat anymore, so I'm not sure if there's other questions that anybody has, or if the panelists want to offer any sort of takeaways if we don't have more questions.
We have a mic in the audience too. If people have questions, they can. Oh,
Yeah.
So.
Okay. We don't, but I can run it down.
Great. I get a second chance. Super. So I am thinking about this question and how it gets from an issue that thousands of people in the community are experiencing to being the focus of both a data project, a project in your office, one that's becoming to this scope. And what can the people in this room do to think about however we are touching the work in conjunction with our community members to elevate projects to become something that looks like this.
That feels like a really big question. What immediately comes to mind is as we started to talk about this work, without exception, every group we talked to, whether it was community members or providers or other lawyers, people said, I had absolutely no idea this was a thing. You are telling me that this many people are losing their driver's license because they can't pay some money that has nothing to do with their safety on the road as a driver. And just the realization that that is a thing, and that's a thing in many states, lots of states have passed reforms, generated so much passion from the audiences that it certainly didn't spark the initiative, but it did very much confirm that it was work we needed to keep doing and keep pushing forward. I think that partially gets at what you're asking. Does anybody else have thoughts about that question, though, of how to... what I'm hearing is sort of how do you tap in to understand what are the other issues like this that might need support and attention and focus to elevate them.
Yeah, I would say also if you are working with partners in the community, that's like another good way to have those conversations about what they're seeing. About what they're seeing in the community. And then to also have those, as you're working with clients to have like conversations about what they're seeing, because there's a lot of knowledge in the community that I think is not always being tapped into, because people are like, oh, I understand how things work or what the scope of the issue is, so they're not tapping into those resources.
I think, at least I could say for myself, my role tends to be more of an intermediary, right? Communities in general know what issues are. People in power often don't know what the issues are, and the role is to sort of amplify the voice of the people or the issues that affect people in ways that people in power will respond to in a way that hopefully is pro-social and productive. So I think the most ignorant people are the people at the top who don't know what's going on. And I can say this because I can go to a community and know full well, right, an eviction issue in a community will be linked to class and race everywhere, right? And also issues of gender. And I'll go to another community and they'll say that's not here. And then I get the data and it's exactly like it is in every other community because these are structural things, right? So it's amplifying voices and educating people who have the power to change things to change.
Someone brought up participatory action research earlier. I think maybe Selena, you mentioned you guys. And there was recently, just last week or the week before, a webinar that NLADA did on participatory action research in the public defender context, but the principles and the lessons certainly apply much more broadly. So for anyone who's looking to learn more about that approach to the work, I would offer that up as one resource to go to that was just recently shared. Other audience questions, comments? Does anybody else want to share examples of good community-based work that's happening in your areas or programs? Right. Well, any final thoughts then from the panel? Concluding remarks?
For me, like, we had a lot of good discussions around a lot of different topics, and I think one of the things that I've been especially driving at is I think across the whole legal services delivery space, we have a lot of anecdotes and intuitions and too often jump to conclusions, and I think we have to be more disciplined about saying, well, how do we test that even when things seem obvious, right? Like, what can we measure there? What data can we gather? How can we better understand this problem? Because oftentimes the things that seem obvious are not really the way things are playing out on the ground. And I think it's really important in this legal services delivery space. And I've seen a couple of programs today with, I think, a lot of good ideas on how to evaluate some of these tools. And I think we have to keep doing that kind of work to evaluate different technologies as we're using them in this space. And I worry a little bit about this anecdotal sort of evaluation of these tools because they're going to lead us astray to think that the tools aren't as capable as they might be. But then there's also areas where we're going to think the tools are capable, but we're not really going to understand how the people that we're designing them for are using them and whether they're actually effective in those different situations.
I think the final thought is related to evaluation is as you're thinking about working on a project, like, don't save the evaluation just at the end. Like, figure out how you can incorporate it in throughout the steps of the process. So this becomes like your gargantuan thing you have to figure out, like, how are we going to measure, how are we going to do this, but like incorporate it at every step. So I think that's really key to getting kind of the rich data and getting those feedback loops that are going to make it continuously like improve.
And I would urge everybody to examine the funder requirements when it comes to data and evaluation and push back when those are not grounded in community-centered principles. I think we just need to be having that conversation. So much of our evaluation is driven by funding requirements, but we should have a voice in setting up what those are. So I hope we can work collaboratively to change some of those. Okay. Thank you all so much. Please remember to complete the evaluation in the app.